Hello again. As you know, I am Eli the Computer Guy. Today's class is Introduction to Domains. So we've been going along in this server track describing different ways to share files and resources among users on your network. We talked about web services, we just talked about work groups, and the final way you can share resources on a network is through something called a domain architecture. Basically, a domain architecture is where you have one server or multiple servers that are responsible for dealing with the security and permissions on the network. So we're going to go into all of this, but basically all a domain is a network that has a server or servers specifically dedicated for the security of the network. Now in this class, this is an introduction class, and so we're going to do an overview of domains and how they work. Now most of you are used to the Windows domain structures, probably with Active Directory domain controllers. Well, that is one way to create a domain network. But you can also use Linux with something called a Samba. You can also use Novell to create a domain network. So there are multiple products available for creating domains, and so this class is gonna more describe what's going on in a domain, why you would want a domain, and what features you should look for when you decide on how you're going to create your domain, whether you use something like Windows or Novell or Samba. So this class is not specifically on Windows domains, it's just on the overall concept of domains. In that vein of thought, please realize that some of the vernacular I use, some of the words that I use to describe things, may not be the exact same words that are used to describe things if you open up a book on domains. So if you open up a Windows book on domains, they may call something other than what I called it. But I'm just trying to give you the overall idea of what the domains are. So again, I'm going to describe the thoughts, the philosophies behind domains, but any particular words, Novell can call things different than Microsoft, which calls things different than Linux. So when you actually go to deploy your own domain, just realize some of the vocabulary might be a little bit different. But that's about it for the introduction. Just give me 1 second and we'll go into the domain basics, and we'll talk about really why you want a domain and what a domain does for you. So let's go over the basics of what a domain is and essentially why you want a domain if you have a large network. So let's imagine that we have a switch, like we always imagine, and this switch has numerous computers connected to it. So you have a huge local area network. You know, this could be 50 computers, 100 computers, 1,000 computers. You have a lot of computers on this network. Now, you want the people that are on your network to be able to share files and folders, to access printers, to have specific security policies. So they may be able to change the background on their computer, or they may or may not be able to install software on their computer. You want to be able to control what the members of your network have access to, and then also what they can do to their computer. As we talked about in a work group environment, every single computer has an inbuilt security mechanism that allows you to go into the individual computer and set up security permissions and file sharing permissions. So you could sit at each and every one of these computers and configure it by hand. Again, as we talked about before, if you have 5 computers, 10 computers, maybe even 20 computers, that's not that big a deal. The cost and benefit analysis, you may not want to deal with a domain controller. You know, it may not be that hard for you to deal with even up to 20 computers. But once you start dealing with 100 computers or 1,000 computers, having to sit down at each and every individual computer whenever you want to make a security policy change is just not going to happen. I mean, imagine 1,000 computers and you have to sit down at every single one of them, even if it's only 10 minutes per computer, physical time to do something. It's going to take you forever. So what they came up with was something called domain controllers and domains. So you have all these work group computers here. Well, onto this local network, you add something called a domain controller. This domain controller is now responsible for the security and for sharing the resources and such on the entire network. So if you want to add a user, if you want to change permissions, so let's say you want people to no longer to be able to install software. You have a lot of people trying to install Napster on their computers, and you want them to stop. Well, instead of having to sit in every single computer and change the security policy on every single computer, you can go to this one single domain controller and you can basically type in and you can say, I want no one other than administrators to have the right to install software onto their computers. And when you do that, that goes out, that replicates to the entire network, and so now nobody will be able to install software on their computer other than administrators. So that's why you want a domain controller. Now when we talk about the domain controller, I want you to understand, like I was talking about in the Introduction to Servers class, that a server is any computer on the network that provides services to other computers on the network, right? Well, this domain controller function, this authentication or security function, is simply a piece of software that can be installed onto a computer, or in the Windows world can be activated on the computer. So this domain controller doesn't necessarily have to be a web server, doesn't have to be a file server, doesn't have to be an Exchange server or a MS SQL server or any of that. This server simply can have the function, its only function can simply be to provide security for the entire network. Especially a lot of people coming from the Microsoft world, since Microsoft bundles all of these different services into one product, the Windows server, they get confused about all these different products and they're not really sure where one product ends and the other begins. What you should remember is this, to have a domain controller, it just means you have one computer on the network that's a server, that's an authentication server and a security server. So again, like I say, if you went with Linux, there's something called Samba. You could install that on just a normal Linux computer, and all of a sudden that is a domain controller. So the service it is providing is authentication and security. Now, how this works is all of the workstation computers are actually added to the domain controller's list of acceptable computers. So you as an administrator have to sit down at each and every computer and add them to the domain. So you sit down, and there's a little process, and you say, I want this computer to be part of the domain, and then you put in your username and password, and as long as it's right, that computer then becomes part of the domain. Once the computer is part of the domain, then when you as a user, whether you're as an administrator or a secretary or whatever, when you sit down at the computer, you will be presented with a login screen. What happens is you then type in your username and password. So if we're sitting at this computer, you type in your username and password, and that information is sent over to the domain controller. The domain controller then looks up your username and looks up your password and makes sure that they're correct. If they're not correct, it gives you back, username and password is not correct. If they are correct, what will happen is it will figure out, or it'll look through its database, it'll see what you have permission to see, so files, folders, printers, basically resources on the network, and then also what security policies you have. So are you allowed to install software on your computer? Are you allowed to open up Internet Explorer? Things like that. It bundles all that up into something called an access control key. That key is then sent back to your computer. And once it's sent back to your computer then can read it and then can see what resources you can access on the network. So the main thing that happens with the domain controller is when you're sitting at a computer that's already become part of the domain, when you log in, your credentials are sent to the domain controller then sees what you're allowed to do, takes that, puts that into something called an access key, and sends that key back to your computer, and then you can either access or not access things, depending on what you're allowed to do. In the domain world, generally whether you're dealing with, again, Microsoft or Novell, things are divided for permissions and security into different groupings. So the basic grouping is your users. Let's call it up here. Users. Users is pretty simple. Users is every single user on the network. So you can give individual users permissions or security policies specifically to them. So you can say Bob is allowed to see this file and folder, but not this file and folder. In a large network that is very difficult to manage, because again, we're not talking about the local mom and pop place with 50 or maybe even 100 employees. We're talking about thousands of employees. And if you try to assign permission to individual employees, thousands of times, that's just a waste of time and energy. So what you can do is you can put users into groups. So you put, if you have a management team, if you have the executive staff, you can put the executives into a group. If you have the accounting department, you can put all the accountants into a group. If you have the law department, you can put all the lawyers into a group. And then you can give groups permissions or security rights. So let's say with those lawyer groups, you could have a folder that anybody who is within, any user who's a member of the lawyer group can access whatever's in that folder. But let's say the computer geeks, you don't want us accessing, all these contracts or legal stuff. So you say the computer geeks, the geeks group, is not allowed to access anything in that folder. So that way, you may have 50 lawyers and 200 geeks. And so instead of having to write out each individual security policy, you can just say for the entire group, no geeks are allowed in, all the lawyers are allowed in. That makes life easy. Or with the geeks, with security policies, you can say that geeks are allowed to install software on computers. Lawyers are not allowed to install software on computers. So if a lawyer logs in when he gets the key, he will not be able to install any software onto his computer. If a geek logs into a computer, he'll be able to install software on it. So those are, you start with the users and then you go to the groups. The next unit that combines everything is something called an organizational unit, or it's called OU, in geek speak, I suppose. OUs, organizational units, can have users, groups, and resources on the network inside of them. So you could put a computer into an organizational unit. Or you could put a printer into an organizational unit and then assign permissions to that organizational unit. So let's say you have kiosks, kiosk computers that are outside your main building. Maybe they're in a mall. And so you don't want your network hacked. So you would put the kiosk computers into an organizational unit that is never allowed to change passwords for anybody. So even if a geek goes to that kiosk computer and he logs in and he wants to try to change passwords on the network, it simply will not be allowed to happen because that organizational unit, that computer, it doesn't have the rights to change passwords. Gets a little complicated, but basically the idea is you have users, groups, and then organizational units. Groups are made up of users. Organizational units are made up of not only users and groups, but also items on the network like printers, computers, Palm devices. Like if you have like an iPhone type device, you can actually put that into an organizational unit. And then it gets even more complicated because then you can nest, it's called nesting. You can put organizational units inside of organizational units. And that's a class unto itself. So users, groups, and organizational units. Now, one of the things two of the terms, I suppose, that I've been tossing around are permissions and security. And it's very important that you understand the difference between those two vocabulary words. Permissions are simply your access to network resources. So are you allowed to open a folder? Are you allowed to edit a file? Are you allowed to print to a printer? Those are permissions. Security, normally in the Windows world, they're called GPOs, group policy objects. Security says what you're actually allowed to do on the particular system. So this means things like, are you allowed to install software onto the computer? Do you have access to the A drive or to the CD drive? Are you allowed to change the background image? Are you allowed to start certain programs? Are you allowed to update software? How often does your password need to be changed? those are security policies. So permissions are simply your access and what you're able to do on the network. Again, open files, read files, edit files, print to printers. Security is what you're able to do on the computer. You know, passwords, install software, that type of thing. So just realize those are two separate critters. Sometimes people don't, they kind of try to lump all the security into one thing, and it's not one thing. You have permissions, and then you have security. They're two entirely different critters. So, as we went over, a domain is simply a network where you have one server that acts as a domain controller. This domain controller has authentication and security software installed on it that allows you to sit at a computer. When you log in, your username and password are sent to that domain controller. That domain controller then makes sure your username and password are correct. If it is correct, it then gives you an access control key. Basically, it sends that key back to your computer, and based on that key, your computer now knows what files and folders you're allowed to get into, whether you're able to install software, etc. Again, these permissions and these security policies can either be assigned to the user, which can be done, but this is usually a bad idea. You usually want to assign security and permissions to entire groups, so users are put into groups. You then also have organizational units. Organizational units can have users, groups, actual stuff on the network, like I say, like printers and computers, and it can also have organizational units inside of organizational units, but that gets into its own class. But this is the underlying idea of what a domain is, and like I say, is if you have 100, 200, 1,000 users or more, I mean, this just makes life easy. So with that, let's we're going to take a minute and we're going to talk about how you can have a domain. So now that we discussed, the basics of what a domain is and why you want it, we have to talk about how you actually get a domain. So the domains that everybody are most used to are the Windows domains. Windows. So in a Windows domain, you have a Windows, they're now called Active Directory server, and you have a Windows client computer. Windows XP Professional, Windows Vista Business Edition, or Windows 7 Business Edition. All you need to do is you need to configure your Windows 2008 server with Active Directory, and then with one of your Business Edition workstation computers, you can then add yourself to that domain. Once you've done that, then that Windows client computer is part of the domain, and now you get all your security policies and all that through that Active Directory domain controller. The very important thing to remember about this whole setup is, first, you have to install, or you have to be using a piece of Windows Server software that includes Active Directory. Almost all of the Windows Server software includes Active Directory, except for, this is be very careful about this, the web edition software. So if you buy Server 2008 Standard Edition, 2003 Standard Edition, anything like that, Small Business Edition, those all have Active Directory built in and included with the software, the server software that you're buying. If you buy 2003 Web Edition or 2008 Web Edition, that does not come with the Active Directory component. You cannot create a domain with either of those two pieces of server software, so just keep that in mind. The other thing with this is you have to use business class workstation operating systems to become a member of a domain. So if you have XP Home Edition, if you have Vista Home Premium Edition, if you have Windows 7 Home Premium or whatever it's called, those operating systems are not able to become a member of a domain. You have to have either Windows XP Professional, Windows Vista Business Edition, or Windows Vista Ultimate Edition, Windows 7 Business Edition, or Windows 7 Ultimate Edition. Those are the only editions of the client software that allow you to become part of the domain. This isn't a little thing you can turn on, and if you have like XP Home Edition, you can't just buy a little $10 piece of software and become part of the domain. it has to be business edition for this to work right. So you have to have a real server. So if you have server 2008 web edition, that's not going to work. You have to have standard edition or higher, and then the client operating systems have to be business editions. This can be a real problem if you're looking to add Macs to your domain, because Macs don't play well with the domain. Depending on what Linux you're using and how it's configured, Linux may or may not play well with the domain. So just keep that in mind with the whole Windows domain model. We're gonna have a whole class on this, but I just want to give you this overview since we're doing this introduction. The next way you can create a domain is with a piece of software called Samba. This is an open source Linux version of a Windows domain controller. So it's completely open source and it's completely free. Again, you have to have business class Windows operating systems to be able to connect to a Samba server. But as long as you do, you can set up a Linux Samba server and have a domain controller that way. The last way you can have a domain controller is with Novell. Novell was actually the one to really create and push out Active Directory, and way back when, in the late 90s when I got into computers, Novell was real competition for Microsoft. It was Microsoft and Novell going head to head. I don't know what happened. Novell still exists, it is still out there, and it might be a good alternative depending on what you were looking to do, but it's not the player that it used to be. It used to be a major player in the domain field. When I got my Microsoft Certified Systems Engineer credential, at that time, you had to weigh whether you want to become a Novell administrator or a Microsoft administrator. And that was a very tough decision. You had to, well, do I really want to do Novell or do I want to do Microsoft? Because at that time, both the certifications were highly sought after. Now, I don't know anybody who uses Novell, so they've kind of gone to the wayside. But they do offer their open server edition that gives you the ability to have a domain controller. But basically, the ways you can have a domain is you either use a Windows server, 2008, 2003, 2000 server, as long as it's not web edition. You have the Active Directory component. You can use Samba. Samba is an open source Linux version of a domain controller, or you can use Novell. Depending on what you need, what you're willing to spend, etc., depends on what you're going to be using. Again, we will have classes on these different actual products. This class right now is just an introduction though. So let's take a moment to talk about the different types of domain controllers. So domain controllers are you sit down at your computer, you log in, your information goes to the domain controller, then that domain controller tells you what you have access to basically. So there are a couple of different types of domain controllers. Some of these are used more or less. Some of them seem old, but the technology is still relevant today. So back in the day, again, when I started in computers, we had something called PDCs and BDCs. So PDC and BDC. PDC meant primary domain controller. BDC meant backup domain controller. So the primary domain controller was like king of the hill. That was where all the computers, when you logged on, all the computers pointed at that primary domain controller, and that primary domain controller gave you access to what you were going to get access to. If an administrator sat down and changed somebody's permissions, they would do that at the primary domain controller. The primary domain controller is basically where everything happened. Then, what you would have is something called backup domain controllers. So what backup domain controllers were these were exact copies of the primary domain controller, but they kind of sat there and were inactive. So the idea was like a live recovery. So if anything happened to the primary domain controller, the backup domain controller would come online so people could log in and log out and get access to resources, and then you would do something where you turned the backup domain controller into a primary domain controller, and then you could make changes to it. So you could not sit down at the backup domain controller and make changes to security schemes. So if you wanted to change somebody's permission, you would have to do that at the primary domain controller, not the backup domain controller. The backup domain controller simply had what was called a read-only record of everything that was on the primary domain controller. So you had the primary domain controller, was king of the hill. That's where all the changes could be made, and that's where everybody actually logged into. Under that, you had backup domain controllers. These were exact copies of the primary domain controllers. If the primary domain controller failed for some reason, people would then be pointed at the backup domain controllers. But these were read-only copies of the whole security scheme, so they could log in and log out and do whatever they could do before the primary domain controller failed. But an administrator couldn't sit at a backup domain controller and make any changes to the security scheme. They could promote the backup domain controller to be a primary domain controller, and then they could do all the changes. This was a bit of a mouthful. It was, and it still is, but this is how it works. So the primary domain controller was king, then you had all these little replicant backup domain controllers. This is the way that Samba still works. So if you decide to install a Linux Samba server, S-A-M-B-A, it works off of the primary domain controller, backup domain controller model. Well, Microsoft and Novell went off and they decided this was a bad way to do business because it really is a pain in the butt. So now they just have DCs, or domain controllers. What happens with domain controllers is when you create the whole Active Directory structure, the domain controllers talk back and forth, and so if there's no primary domain controller, they are all responsible for control of the domain. So if you have a large network, you may have 5 domain controllers because you don't want a domain controller to fail, or multiple domain controllers to fail and keep people off the network. So if you had 5, let's see, whenever anybody logs in or whenever any changes are made, that information is replicated to all 5 or 4 other domain controllers. So if an administrator sits down on this domain controller and makes a change, then after that change is made, that change gets replicated to every other domain controller that's part of that Active Directory scheme. This right here is a whole 40-hour class unto itself on Active Directory replication. You just have to understand that it happens. So now, since that information gets replicated across all the domain controllers, if any single one domain controller fails, the network doesn't care. The other 4 domain controllers keep doing what they're doing. If another one fails, the other 3 keep doing what they're doing. If another one fails, the other 2 are doing. Another one fails. Your final domain controller is still trucking along fine. If this one fails, well, you're screwed. But in this scheme, there's nothing that manually has to be done. So in this scheme where you had a primary domain controller and a backup domain controller, if the primary domain controller failed, the backup domain controller was online, but it was a read-only version. An administrator actually had to log into the backup domain controller and do something called promote it to being a primary domain controller. And then the network was running normal again. In an Active Directory structure, this is all just an automatic process that happens. So a server can sit down at this domain controller, or this domain controller, or this domain controller, or this domain controller, or this domain controller. When they make a change, that change is replicated throughout the rest of the Active Directory structure. Again, this is just an overview. It gets much more complicated than this, but I want you to give you an idea of the whole concept for domain controllers. Because it really is important. So you used to have the primary domain controllers and backup domain controllers. Now with Active Directory, you just have domain controllers. So with that, we'll get into a little more complicated stuff of whole domain structures. So now that we've talked about the primary domain controllers and backup domain controllers and domain controllers in general, I want to give you a little idea of how domains get structured in the real world. So if you have a little company, you have 100 people or you have 1,000 people all in one building, then all your entire domain structure is going to be, you're going to have your domain controller or controllers. So let's say you'll have 4 domain controllers in case anything bad happens. And then those connect to your network with 1,000 computers connected to it. And that's your structure. There's not a lot to this structure. You have the domain controllers that give permissions and security to the clients on the system, and that's it. That's no big deal. But once you start getting into the really big world, you start getting these large domain structures. And when you start doing research on this, they will talk about the vocabulary is called forests, trees, and domains. I'm not going to get into whole forests and trees and domains, but I will give you an overview of how it works. So let's imagine we have a very large company. So a lot of times you'll hear about umbrella companies or parent companies. So you may have one company here that owns a company underneath of it. So it owns this company. Then this company owns 2 or 3 companies. And those companies own 3 or 4 companies. So each one of those companies should have its own domain because it is its own separate, company. So when I started in computers, we had the parent company that I was employed by because I was a computer geek for everybody. Under this main company, we had one installation company. So this company, their company, what they did was install equipment. And then we had a sales company. So this company installed equipment. So you had the parent company, you had the installation company, and then you had the sales company. These were all individual companies with their own accounting, their own books, their own promotion structure, everything. Human resources for this person was not the same for human resources for this person was not the same for human resources for this person. These were all separate companies, but of course they work together. So if you have a structure like this, you will probably have 3 different domains. So you want one domain here for the installers, one domain here for the sales, and then one domain up here for the executives. And they will have their own security schemes. So far that doesn't seem very complicated. But again, I am a geek. I have to install stuff, I have to set up stuff, I have to fix virus problems for everybody. So if I have a user account up here with the umbrella company, obviously I can go to the computers on this network and I have permissions to do whatever it is I need to do. So I have permissions to install software or uninstall software or change backgrounds. I have all those permissions. The question is, what happens when I come down to the installation domain? So I have to go and fix the director's computer in this installation company. Or I have to go and fix the director's computer in the sales company. This is an entirely different domain. Well, in the domain world, you can give trusts to other domains. So what would happen in this instance is the sales domain would trust the executive domain whatever the user accounts are up here. So since the executive domain says that I'm a geek, that allows me to install software. If I go to a computer down at the sales domain and log in, my login credentials will go up, they'll go all the way back to the executive domain. That executive domain will give me my permissions, what I'm allowed to do. That key comes to the sales domain. The sales domain says, hey, I trust the executive domain, and so this person is allowed to do whatever it is that he's allowed to do. Install software, etc. If I go over to the installation domain, if there's a trust set up here, I can do the same thing. So in these large systems, you have individual domains, but you can set up what are called trust relationships. So does this domain trust this domain? Does this domain trust this domain? Because imagine, so I am the uber geek. I am the geek of the umbrella company, which means I'm really cool. And yes, I was really cool. So I can go and I can log in here and I can log in here and I get all of my rights. But let's say this company down here, it doesn't feel like it's getting enough technical support from the umbrella company. So they say, well, we want to hire our own geeks, and we want to give them authority to do all the changes on the network. So they create this little geeks group down here. Well, that's all fine and dandy, but the executives, they hired me. They don't want to deal with these geeks. So if this geek here came up and tried to log into the executive group, the executive, this umbrella company, may not trust them. It'll allow them to log in, but when it looks for that trust, do I trust users from this other domain? It'll go, oh no, those aren't geeks of our quality. So I can come down here and log into their domain and do whatever I want. If their geeks come in and try to log into the upper domain, they will not be allowed to do anything because our domain doesn't trust them. You can then also, let's say you have the geeks here, and sometimes they need to go over work on the sales. So sales might say, we like those geeks. So they could create a trust relationship here where the geeks here can log into the sales domain and make changes. Again, this goes into lots of experience and lots of training and lots of classes. But this gives you an idea of the larger concept of how domains work in the real world, because every single company needs to have or should have its own domain because it should have its own security structure. But in the modern mega corporation, global enterprise world, companies are owned by companies that own other companies. And so if you need to have, let's say, like I say, a technician that needs to go and be able to deal with all these different companies, you need that technician to have the ability to log in and do whatever it needs to be done. The way you get that to happen is by creating what are called trust relationships between these domains. So you can have what are called one-way trusts, two-way trusts, transitive trusts. It's a lot of different trusts. Just realize though that somebody, so I'm in the executive domain. If you come up with a trust relationship, I can log into the sales domain and have all my rights and permissions that I would as if I was in the executive domain. The geeks here can have all the rights and the permissions in the world to the installer's domain. If they come up here to this umbrella company, they don't have any rights and permissions because this umbrella company doesn't trust them. This is the basic concept of trusts and how all these domains work together. Well, so you're still following me there. I hope you've kept up with all this. Servers get to be incredibly complicated. That's why high-end server technicians or administrators make lots and lots and lots and lots of money. I mean, those trust relationships and Active Directory schemes. I mean, this is how network administrators can make $250,000 a year, because if they are the ones that are responsible for just this whole mess of replication and trusts and everything over a massive corporate network. I mean, it's a lot to understand and to be able to do. So again, this was an introduction class. I'm just trying to give you the overall concept of how this works. Again, not delve into specific products yet. So we talked in the beginning about what the domain controller is. So a domain controller is simply a server, just a server like we talked about before, that has this security software built into it. So what happens is a client computer on the network. If you sit down, you log into that client computer, it sends your credentials to this authentication server. The authentication server figures out what you're allowed to do and then sends an access key back to the client computer. And then you can do whatever it is it allows you to do. The reason you like domains or domain controllers can be good is if you have large networks, it means that administrators can sit down at a single computer on the network and change permissions and policies and the rest of that. They don't have to go to all those 500 different computers, because that would just be horrible. We talked about the difference between permissions and security. And this is one, like I say, a lot of people get confused on. I don't know why, they just do. Permissions are the files and the resources on the network that you have access to. So can you print to a printer? So if you have a really expensive color printer, you may not want everybody on the network to print to it. So you may deny them permission to print to that color printer. Or you may give access to a folder or to a file. That's what a permission is. Security is what you're allowed to do on the computer. So are you allowed to access the CD drive? Are you allowed to install software? How often do you have to wait before you change passwords? That type of thing. That is security. Now this can be assigned, both permissions and security, either based on the user. So the user is you, me, anybody logging on to the network. There has to be a user account. You can do that, but again, that's a lot of maintenance and that's a lot of just pain in the butt. What normally happens is users are grouped into groups. So you put user accounts into groups and then you assign permissions to the entire group. So if you have lawyers, if you have geeks, if you have salespeople, you put all the salespeople into the sales group, all the lawyers into the lawyers group, all the geeks into the geek group, and then you just say, geeks are allowed to do this, lawyers are allowed to do this, and salespeople are allowed to do this. That is much easier and a lot less time consuming than literally saying, okay, Bob can do this, Robert can do this, John can do this, Paul can do this, because you do have to sit down and actually type all of this stuff into a computer. Then of course, beyond groups is something called organizational units. You can put just about anything in the world or on a network into an organizational unit. So organizational units can contain user accounts, they can contain groups, they can contain computers, they can contain printers, they can contain other organizational units. And then you can assign permissions or security onto that entire organizational unit. Again, where organizational units come up a lot is things like if you want to make sure hackers don't get in by hacking printers. So as we talked about before, printers have their own built-in print server. Well, what if somebody could hack that little print server and then try to gain access to the rest of the network that way? Well, if you put all the printers into an organizational unit and say that the printers have absolutely no rights to do anything on the network, then you don't have to worry about hackers trying to hack into your printer and then having your printer try to run commands on the network. I mean, that kind of stuff really can't happen in the real world. We talked about the different ways that you can have the domain, or basically the different products that are available to you. So the main product that everybody is used to, and what you will probably use at the end of the day, is the Windows system. So you need a Windows 2008 or 2003 server, and you need client computers with a Business Edition operating system. Again, Windows XP Professional, Vista Business Edition, or Ultimate Edition, or Windows 7 Business or Ultimate Edition. You cannot make a Home Edition computer part of a domain. It's just not part of the product. Again, when you buy the server software, make sure you do not buy Web Edition. Web Edition is good for many things, but it doesn't have the ability to be a domain controller. So I know when you're going to go out to buy server software, you're going to see that the Web Edition only costs $300 or $400, so you're going to want to buy that. That does not give you the ability to do domain controllers. We talked a little bit about Samba. Samba is Linux's open source free way of creating a domain controller. So you install that onto a Linux server, and then that Linux server will act like what's called a PDC, a primary domain controller. You can also do Novell. Again, I haven't run into Novell in years, to be honest with you. I mean, I did a little research for this class, and they still exist. They're still putting out servers, but I don't know anyone who uses them. But they do give you the ability to create domains, you know, give permissions and give security to computers and users on the network. So it's a possibility. We talked about the different types of domain controllers. Remember, back in the old days, or if you use Samba, you have primary domain controllers and backup domain controllers. The primary domain controller is king of the hill. That is the one that everybody logs into, and when any changes are made, those changes are written to the primary domain controller. You then have something called a backup domain controller. The backup domain controller contains a read-only copy of everything that is on the primary domain controller. If the primary domain controller fails, people can still log in and do whatever they were doing based on the information of the backup domain controller. but administrators cannot make changes to the security scheme on a backup domain controller. They have to manually do something called promote the backup domain controller to be a primary domain controller. And then once that happens, they're able to make changes. That, of course, it was just a tedious pain in the butt, which was harder to do than it was to say. And so in Windows 2000 servers and above, Windows implemented Active Directory. Active Directory means all domain controllers are domain controllers. They have both read and write ability on the network. So you can cluster 3 or 4 or 5 or 100 domain controllers together. When people log in, they just log into the closest domain controller. If a domain controller fails, then the other domain controllers automatically just take up the slack. If a change is made to one domain controller, that change is then replicated to all of the other domain controllers. And that's the overview of what happens. If you actually want to learn about Active Directory replication, that's a class unto itself. We then talked about the structure. I mean, if you have multiple domains within one company or one organization, and we talked about trusts. Again, this is a long, horrible, tedious class, but we gave you an overview of what trusts are. So if you have the parent company here and you have the child companies, if I'm a geek from the parent company, I can log in to any computer in the child company and do whatever it is I need to do, and I have permissions to do that. But if a geek from a child company goes up to the parent company, they don't get any rights. Or if the two child companies want to be able to swap people, they may be able to swap people, but those people can't log in to the parent company. Basically, what the trusts are is does your domain trust another domain? Yes or no? Again, there's something called one-way trusts, two-way trusts, transitive trusts, and a few other trusts. You only get into this, like I say, in the large corporate world, but you're gonna run into it, at least in paperwork, so you should know that it exists. Again, in the Microsoft world and Novell world, these are called forests and trees. When we start doing actual technical classes on this, we'll get into the more specific products. But that's domains for you. Domains are a wonderful, great thing. They actually, they're not as complicated as I showed you. Again, if you have this huge mega corporation, then they're insanely complicated, and your senior network administrator is going to make $250,000 a year because it is that insanely complicated. Most companies, the companies that you're probably going to be dealing with, they will have 1 or 2 domain controllers in a single building, and everybody will simply access them. So in that model, it's really not that complicated. So I'm out of breath. So as I normally say, I hope you've understood what we've been talking about. Again, this is still on the introduction series of this track. We're going to get more into this, but this gives you the overarching ideas of servers and domains and how all of this works. As you know, I'm Eli the Computer Guy. This was Introduction to Domains. I look forward to seeing you at the next class.